At first, everyone thought this virus was just an ordinary flu, until millions of people turned into monsters. The film is set in Taipei and follows the lives of a couple named Jim and Kat, who spend their days together like any ordinary lovers. One morning, shortly after waking up, Kat reminds Jim to get ready to take her to the station because she has an important meeting at the company headquarters. During their casual conversation before starting the day, Kat brings up their long-awaited vacation plans once again. After working hard and carefully arranging her schedule, she has finally managed to secure a leave that was not easy to obtain. However, at the same time, Jim reveals that he has just received a job offer as a photographer for a major advertising project from a German company. Unfortunately, the project will most likely take place during the same period as their planned vacation. Hearing this, Kat seems disappointed because she has worked so hard just to get the chance to spend time away with Jim. To her, the time they could spend together means much more, especially since Jim has been struggling to find stable work lately. Realizing his words have upset her, Jim quickly apologizes and promises that he will try speaking with his employer to see if his schedule can be changed. Although a small argument occurs between them, their relationship still reflects warmth and understanding toward one another. Amid their morning routine, Jim briefly watches a news segment on YouTube showing a debate between a host and a virologist. During the broadcast, the doctor warns the public about the Alvin virus, which has long been considered no more dangerous than a common flu. According to his research, the virus has the potential to mutate into something far more serious. However, his warnings are met with skepticism because many people believe the threat is being exaggerated for certain interests. Some even think discussions surrounding outbreaks are being used as political tools ahead of the upcoming election. Jim himself does not pay much attention to the news because he is still occupied with his own personal concerns. Yet without realizing it, strange things have already started happening around him. While looking outside the apartment, Jim notices an elderly woman behaving in a very unsettling manner. But when he briefly turns away after hearing Kat call his name, the woman suddenly disappears without a trace. Although it feels strange, Jim chooses to ignore it and assumes it is nothing important. Not long after, Jim notices his neighbor, who appears to be suffering from a severe flu. Seeing how terrible the man's condition looks, Jim suggests that he should go to the hospital immediately. However, his neighbor only laughs off the concern and claims that all the news about outbreaks is nothing but nonsense. According to him, pandemics and virus-related issues are deliberately exaggerated by the media and the government to gain certain advantages. Once everything is ready, Jim finally takes Kat to the station on his motorcycle. Along the way, they witness a disturbance where several police officers are trying to arrest someone who has violently attacked another civilian. The sight leaves Jim and Kat confused because the behavior seems unusual, though they still assume it is simply an ordinary criminal incident. After arriving at the station, Jim says goodbye as usual and even promises that he will always protect Kat no matter what happens. The simple promise makes Kat smile. After parting ways with her, Jim intends to continue his day as normal. However, while heading back, he begins to notice that the atmosphere around him feels increasingly strange. The police officers who were handling the earlier disturbance have suddenly disappeared, and their patrol car has been abandoned with its doors left open. Despite sensing that something is wrong, Jim continues to a convenience store to buy some snacks. While waiting for his order, he reads an article about property prices because deep down, he still dreams of building a home and a future together with Kat. But without Jim realizing it, the elderly woman he saw earlier appears once again. This time, her behavior is far more horrifying, and within moments the entire store descends into chaos as she begins violently attacking the people around her. At first, Jim is merely confused and tries to back away, but before the old woman can reach him, a speeding car suddenly crashes into her and sends her flying. Instead of feeling relieved, Jim becomes even more terrified after seeing the driver, who is also behaving in a horrifying manner as if he has completely lost his sanity. Even worse, several people who were previously attacked by the old woman suddenly begin acting violently and start chasing Jim for no clear reason. Realizing that the situation around him is no longer normal, Jim immediately runs back toward his apartment. Once he arrives, Jim tries to calm himself down while figuring out what is actually happening. However, the moment he turns on the television, every channel is suddenly broadcasting emergency alerts. That is when Jim begins to realize that this is no ordinary riot anymore. Panicking, he quickly tries to contact Kat to make sure she is safe, but while distracted by his phone, his own neighbor suddenly appears from behind and attacks him with a head shears, causing Jim to lose 2 of his fingers. Although Jim manages to fight back and knock the man down, his neighbor continues moving as if he cannot feel pain at all. Realizing he cannot survive there much longer, Jim decides to escape while enduring the intense pain in his hand. At that point, he finally understands that nearly everyone around the apartment complex has transformed into violent monsters, attacking anyone in sight. As Jim grabs his motorcycle to flee, several infected people suddenly notice him and immediately begin chasing after him. Within seconds, more and more people join the pursuit, forcing Jim to speed away as fast as possible. Meanwhile, Kat, who is still inside the train, has no idea that the city outside has already descended into chaos. Inside the carriage, everything initially seems normal despite an elderly man named Johnny constantly trying to start a conversation with her. Johnny repeatedly compliments Kat's beauty and attempts to act friendly, but his behavior only makes Kat uncomfortable. After being bothered continuously, Kat finally warns Johnny to stop before she reports him to the police. Hearing her response, Johnny becomes disappointed and complains that women always treat him the same way, even though he believes he is only trying to be nice. Wanting to avoid further conversation with him, Kat eventually switches seats with a woman named Molly. However, without any of the passengers realizing it, the atmosphere inside the train slowly begins to change. Suddenly, a man wearing glasses violently attacks another passenger, causing the entire carriage to panic. Within moments, the situation spirals out of control as several other passengers also begin acting savagely and attacking anyone nearby. Kat can only sit frozen in fear as she witnesses the horrifying scene, while Johnny, who previously appeared completely normal, suddenly becomes violent as well and brutally attacks Molly, leaving her seriously injured. When the train finally stops, all the passengers rush out in desperation to save themselves. Amid the chaos, Kat decides to take Molly away from the crowd because she believes crowded places are even more dangerous. However, without them realizing it, Johnny notices where they are going and begins chasing them. During their escape, Kat and Molly encounter a man who tries to stop Johnny because he assumes the old man is simply a criminal attacking women. Unfortunately, the man has no idea how dangerous Johnny has become. Without hesitation, Johnny brutally attacks him, making Kat and Molly even more terrified by the savagery of the infected people. After finally escaping, Kat tries asking for help from a man standing near the station exit. However, the man panics and quickly shuts the door because he thinks Kat and Molly have also turned into monsters like the others. Fortunately, they manage to slip through the closing door just in time. Furious, Molly immediately yells at the man while a man named Kevin explains that he was only scared because he could not tell who was still normal and who had already turned violent. Realizing that Molly's condition is getting worse because of her injuries, Kevin finally suggests taking her to the nearest hospital so she can receive treatment as soon as possible. However, none of them realize that Johnny is still following them from a distance and has overheard exactly where they are heading next. Long story short, after finally arriving at the hospital, Molly receives treatment for her injuries. Amid the increasingly chaotic situation, Molly takes a moment to thank Kat for trying to help her ever since they escaped from the station. She even says that she will never forget Kat's kindness. Even so, Molly still seems upset with Kevin because earlier he nearly abandoned them out of fear. Meanwhile, the situation outside the hospital grows even more uncontrollable. Jim, who is still struggling to survive, slowly realizes that almost the entire city has turned into a place filled with chaos. Everywhere he looks, there are dead bodies scattered across the streets and violent people attacking others without mercy. Believing that the city center has become far too dangerous, Jim decides to head toward the hills in hopes of finding a safer place to hide for a while. Along the way, Jim tries to treat the severe wound on his hand using duct tape to stop the bleeding from getting worse. It is there that he discovers a sickle, which he takes with him as a weapon to defend himself. However, the brief moment of calm does not last long because Jim suddenly hears strange noises coming from nearby bushes. When he goes to investigate, he finds several young boys who have already turned savage and are cruelly toying with a man who is still alive. Seeing this, Jim cannot bring himself to leave the victim behind, so he immediately attacks the boys in order to save him. After a short fight, Jim successfully scares them away. Unfortunately, when he tries to help the injured man, he realizes that the victim has also begun turning violent and even attempts to attack him. Understanding that he is becoming trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation, Jim quickly escapes on his motorcycle before the group of boys returns. Elsewhere, panic has also started spreading throughout the hospital. The survivors still cannot understand what exactly is happening that could turn ordinary people into such brutal monsters in such a short amount of time. Police officers and security guards attempt to protect the hospital from infected people trying to enter the building, but the situation remains chaotic because nobody truly knows how to stop the outbreak. In the middle of the confusion, Kat suddenly realizes that she lost her phone during the chaos on the train. Because of that, she borrows Kevin's phone to contact Jim and make sure her boyfriend is still alive. Unfortunately, Jim does not answer immediately because he is too busy escaping from infected people. At the same time, the televisions inside the hospital suddenly begin broadcasting a live government announcement. During the emergency statement, the president finally admits that the country is facing a massive outbreak with an unknown cause. He explains that millions of people have already become victims and several cities have been placed under isolation in an attempt to stop the chaos from spreading further. However, the situation suddenly turns horrifying when one of the military officials standing beside him during the live broadcast abruptly becomes violent and attacks the people around him. The broadcast is immediately cut off, causing everyone inside the hospital to panic even more as they realize the true situation is far worse than what the government had announced. After the broadcast ends, the atmosphere inside the hospital rapidly spirals out of control. People begin arguing and turning against one another. In the middle of the chaos, Johnny suddenly appears along with several other infected individuals. He continues searching for Kat while violently attacking anyone standing in his way. That is when Johnny finds Molly, whose condition has already become extremely weak because of her injuries. Meanwhile, Kevin is so terrified that he can only hide and pray the infected people do not discover him. Not long afterward, Jim finally notices several missed calls on his phone. The moment he calls back and hears Kat's voice, he feels relieved knowing that she is still alive. Kat explains that she is trapped inside the hospital and cannot escape because the entire place has already been overrun by violent infected people. Hearing this, Jim immediately promises that he will come and rescue her no matter what happens. Even so, returning to the city center is clearly not an easy task because almost the entire area has turned into a massive slaughterhouse, and Jim has to face it all alone. Meanwhile, the situation inside the hospital continues getting worse. As Kevin attempts to flee, he accidentally runs into Molly again, only to discover that she has now become one of the infected. Still holding a grudge against him, Molly immediately chases Kevin together with several other infected people. At the same time, Kat escapes toward the upper floors of the hospital in search of a safer hiding place. She even locks the door using a metal bar to keep Johnny from entering. However, Johnny's strength now feels far more terrifying than before. He easily bends the barrier and forces his way into the room while making sure nobody else interferes with his hunt. Johnny appears completely obsessed with Kat and wants to find her all for himself. While Johnny is distracted searching for Kat, she quietly hides while holding a fire extinguisher. The moment Johnny lets his guard down, Kat sprays the extinguisher directly into his face. She immediately takes advantage of the opportunity and brutally strikes Johnny with the heavy extinguisher until she finally manages to kill him. After successfully killing Johnny, a man wearing a hazmat suit suddenly appears and orders Kat to enter a sealed room. Since the situation outside has already become far too dangerous, Kat has no choice but to follow him. However, once inside, the man suddenly points a gun at Kat and forces her to handcuff herself to a pipe. Terrified, Kat initially refuses because she does not know who the man is or whether he can still be trusted. The man then explains that everything is being done to make sure Kat has not been infected by the virus. Afterward, Kat is sprayed with disinfectant and forced to change her clothes because her previous outfit has already been contaminated with blood from infected people.
手铐铐住要怎么脱？那你在妇产科病房干嘛？
平常不会有人上来。那病毒会发生。病原系统不是我的好啦。
Not long later, the man introduces himself as Alan Wong, a virologist who has been studying the Alvin virus for a long time. Alan explains that the Alvin virus was originally nothing more than a common flu, but it has now evolved into something much more horrifying. Unlike ordinary zombies, the Alvin virus does not make people lose their consciousness. The infected still remember who they are, can still think clearly, and fully understand what is happening around them. However, the virus removes their ability to control anger, lust, violence, and the darkest desires hidden deep inside them. As a result, they become terrifying monsters willing to do absolutely anything to satisfy those urges, even though they still understand that what they are doing is wrong. Alan reveals that he has been trying to warn people about the dangers of the Alvin virus for a very long time. Unfortunately, almost nobody took his warnings seriously, and many believed he was simply exaggerating. According to Alan, the government deliberately ignored the threat because they feared that extreme measures such as mass quarantines would only worsen the political and economic situation. Because of that, the outbreak spread uncontrollably until it eventually became a disaster that could no longer be stopped. After noticing that Kat still has not shown any symptoms despite repeatedly being exposed to infected bodily fluids, Alan begins suspecting that she may possess a natural immunity to the virus. However, instead of performing a normal examination, Alan secretly injects the Alvin virus directly into Kat's body in order to test his theory.
血液可以用来制造疫苗。
He explains that if Kat shows no changes after several minutes, her blood could potentially become the key to creating a vaccine capable of saving millions of lives. Naturally, Kat becomes furious after realizing she has been turned into a test subject without her permission, but she has no choice except to wait for the results. While waiting, Alan begins talking about several abandoned babies who were previously left inside the hospital's maternity ward. According to him, if the babies had simply been abandoned during the chaos, their fate would likely have been far worse. Desperate to find a natural antibody, Alan eventually injected the Alvin virus into the babies as part of his research. However, almost all of them failed to survive after being infected, and only one infant managed to last slightly longer before eventually turning as well. Even so, Alan still believes that everything he has done was the most logical decision in order to find hope for saving the remaining survivors. While Alan is distracted, Kat secretly manages to send a message to Jim, telling him that she is trapped inside one of the rooms on the 8th floor. At the same time, Alan receives news that a rescue helicopter will soon arrive at the hospital rooftop to pick him up. Since Kat still shows no signs of infection, even after being injected with the virus, Alan becomes increasingly convinced that her body may truly be immune. Because of that, he brings Kat toward the rooftop, believing that her blood could become humanity's final hope for developing a vaccine. However, before they can escape, the situation suddenly spirals into chaos again when one of the infected discovers their location and attacks Alan. Alan suffers a serious injury to his leg that leaves him struggling to walk, forcing Kat to help carry him toward the rooftop before more infected people arrive. At the same time, Jim finally reaches the hospital after surviving a long and horrific journey. But, without realizing it, the Alvin virus has already started affecting him as well. Jim is still fully conscious, still remembers Kat and the promise he made to rescue her, but his mind slowly becomes consumed by violent urges. Realizing what is happening, Alan attempts to shoot Jim, but he ends up becoming a victim of Jim's attack instead. Terrified, Kat quickly locks the gate leading to the rooftop area using the key she got from Alan. From behind the gate, Jim continues calling out to Kat and begs her to open the door, while Kat can only cry as she watches the horrifying transformation of the man she loves. In the middle of the situation, Kat asks Jim what he actually feels after becoming infected with the Alvin virus. Jim then explains that ever since he heard Kat's terrified voice on the phone, he finally felt as though his life had a purpose again, and that purpose was finding Kat. However, his love has now twisted into a horrifying desire to hurt the person he cares about most. If he manages to catch Kat, he wants to torture her and devour her alive. Hearing those words, Kat can only cry because she realizes that the man standing before her is no longer the Jim she once knew. All of their dreams together, including the vacation they had been looking forward to for so long, will never come true. A few moments later, Kat hears the sound of a helicopter approaching the hospital, causing her to immediately run toward the rooftop. Meanwhile, Jim, now completely consumed by the virus, can only watch as Kat disappears from his sight. Although Kat manages to escape, her future remains uncertain because Alan has believed from the very beginning that her body may possess immunity to the Alvin virus. If that theory is true, Kat will most likely become a research subject to help develop a vaccine and may ultimately become humanity's last hope for stopping the outbreak. And with that, the story comes to an end.